When winning feels like losing. When winning feels like losing. It's this common pattern for the people of God, but if we're really honest, especially in our context, it's a pattern that we often try to ignore, evade, or even manipulate. We know that God is victorious. God wins. And we know what this reality means for us as his people. Because God wins, we're victorious. Because he wins, we win. But sometimes this translates or even mistranslates into an unhealthy desire for unbridled and uninterrupted success and victory here and now. We think God's victory means our victory as we define it. A suffering-free life, blissful and happy relationships, failure-free faith, a victorious Christianity that comes with a good salary, health benefits, and a retirement savings plan. Just one look at the list of Christianity's bestsellers, and there are tons of books written about success and victory in the Christian life. There are tons of sermon series on using God's word, either in an abusive way or in a good way at times, to obtain victory and good things for ourselves, either personally or relationally, societally. We like winning. We love victory. And oftentimes we often think that Christianity is about winning and victory, here and now. We open up God's word and we turn to places like Hebrews chapter 11, and we see that it describes God's people as those who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. That's the narrative that often dominates our description of what it means to follow Jesus, what we imagine and picture for our lives. But do we have a category for the kind of Christianity that Hebrews 11 describes after that? Those who suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, and killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. The thing about this description in Hebrews chapter 11 is that all these people were commended for their faith and their trust and their hope in God. And they're all victorious because God is victorious. But the way to that victory, brothers and sisters, it doesn't always feel like winning. That's what this tells us. Sometimes winning feels like losing. So I could go on, right? But we know this to be true, not just from Scripture, but even in our own lives. Winning often feels like losing. In spite of all the books and the sermon series and the conferences on victory in the Christian life and winning, and even though suffering and weakness and loss is something that's familiar to all kinds of people in this world, this is what the Christian life feels like, especially at times, right? You look at Romans chapter 8 and we see the long list of difficulties and difficult realities that we encounter as Christians, things that look to separate us from the love of God. Peril, death, famine, sword. And we see the hard pressing that we endure and we encounter. The perplexity, the persecution, the being struck down, even being given over to death, as Paul describes in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Again, winning so often feels like losing. And even if we look in our own lives, sometimes the most noticeable moments where Jesus is being formed in us, to use that big word, that we're being sanctified, it's in the moments of suffering and hardship, weakness, failure, pandemics, intense moments in our society and culture, loss. And it's in these moments and through these things that God shows himself as victorious and strong around us, but also in us. So, brothers and sisters, we love victory. We have victory as God's people. But do we have a category for Christianity that on the road to victory, leans in at times to what feels like losing and even defeat. That's the path that we're on here in John chapter 18. Last week we saw how the Jewish temple police, along with some Roman soldiers, were led by this man Judas, a former disciple of Jesus, just moments and hours earlier. He led them to the place where Jesus and his disciples were meeting to arrest Jesus illegally. We saw that Judas's prioritization and preservation of himself is what led him to flee from Jesus and ultimately betray him. But we also saw Peter, the disciple of Jesus, with the same exact motives. He responded not by fleeing from Jesus, but fighting for Jesus. We could say that both of these men prioritized following Jesus as long as it meant their strength, their preservation, their winning. But the moment where Jesus' path, Jesus' trajectory turned towards suffering and death and loss, what appeared to be weakness, then both men diverted. And they ended up choosing themselves and their own directions. So now we see here in verse 12 that this band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And what unfolds for us in this passage this week are two scenes that are happening at the same time. John goes back and forth, but we're going to look at them in two separate instances. And the first scene is where Jesus is illegally and speedily put on trial in something of a kangaroo court, but actually feels more like a mob interrogation. The next scene, it's happening simultaneously as Peter is orbiting this mock trial, continuing to pursue his own self-preservation and encountering his own trial and his own interrogation. These two scenes. So let's jump in. Again, the first thing that I want to remind us of is that this entire process that Jesus is being put through is illegal. It is not customary Jewish legal practice in these days to do what we see happens here. The Jewish legal process had much more formality in the process of convicting an alleged lawbreaker. In everything from the time of day that this trial was being held, it was night, to the location where this trial was being held. They didn't happen in the high priest's home. The presence or the lack of presence and credibility of witnesses that needed to be determined. There are no witnesses here. The time in between issuing a verdict, which would often take a day in these times, to the lack of charges being presented. There are no charges here when Jesus is dragged into the home of this high priest, in air quotes. The whole thing is illegal. But just like last week, we're seeing this system, this entire system, this corrupt system is now coming out against Jesus. They conspired against him, and now it's happening. And the reality is, Jesus is far from the only person that they did this to in this day. Again, you remember back in John chapter 11, this large group of Jewish religious leaders and authorities, the Jewish elite, this group called the Sanhedrin, they got together to conspire against Jesus. And this group was led by the high priest, a man named Caiaphas, a man who's mentioned again here in verse 14, who said ultimately back in John chapter 11 that it was better for them, these Jewish elite and religious leaders, it was better for them in their place and their power and their position that one man, Jesus, this disruptor, this revolutionary they perceived him to be. It's better that this one man should die for the people and not that the whole nation perish or be taken away from them. Again, this is a broken system made up of sinful people who will commit injustice to preserve their power and their place. So let's not be surprised at this kind of thing, brothers and sisters. We see it in every single society that is that's occupied by sinful people who come together and prioritize and pursue power and are willing to do anything to protect it. This is what sinful people do. These kinds of situations that we see that Jesus is going through, they don't often make the statistics. They don't support the promoted values of the society. Remember, these were the Jews. This was a society that was allegedly built on the law of God. What we read in the first 5 books of the Bible, Judeo principles. And yet here's Jesus, illegally standing in the home of a man who hasn't charged him, can't condemn him, with no witnesses at a time of night when none of this should be taking place. Look at verse 13. The man whose home he's standing in, this man was Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now, this man Annas, he had been high priest before, and he was removed from his position at some point by the Roman governor Valerius Gratus, which describes this sort of political relationship between the high priest and the governor that was built on corruption, that was largely based on bribery and quid pro quo. I scratch my back, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Historians say that Annas and his family were wealthy and unscrupulous and corrupt leaders of the priesthood whose presence defiled the sanctuary. Ancient Jewish literature records a diss track or this lyric about Annas and his family. It said this: "Woe to the house of Annas, woe to their serpents' hits. They are high priests. Their sons are keepers of the treasury. Their sons-in-law are guardians of the temple, and their servants beat people with staves." So who is this man Annas? Well, he was a high priest, but he's a boss. And I don't mean that in a good way. He's like a crime family boss. And so like any crime family that runs on selling a particular product, that brings money into the empire to establish it and build it. Can you guess what brings in money for Annas' family? Religion. Religion. Judaism's religious industrial complex. Particularly for Annas and his family, it was several merchant booths at the temple and in the surrounding area. Merchant booths that would sell animals for sacrifices, that would exchange money for the poor and for tourists at exponential rates. Where have you heard of this before? All of these were businesses that would have exploited the poor, oppressed people, and fattened the pockets and the power of Annas and his family. That's who Annas is. And so now you can probably guess why Jesus has been brought here first. To the personal residence of a man who isn't even in office, who is still referred because of his influence as high priest, late at night, against all legal procedure. Now come on, let's be real about this. Is it because Annas and his family really care about Jesus' effect on the spiritual climate in Israel? Is it because Jesus' teaching is misleading people from true worship of Yahweh? No. Annas is here to tell Jesus, you messing with my money. You're threatening the order and the status and our power. See, by going into the temple in John chapter 2, at one of the most profitable times of the year, and then driving out the merchants, driving out the merchandise. Oh, you done messed up, Jesus. You done gone too far. You can teach and do miracles and do all the little stuff, and you can gather the crowds and feed them bread, but when you mess with my money, my power, my position, the preservation of myself and the status quo, when you mess with that, you done stepped out your lane. They don't care about the people. They don't care about theology or worship of Yahweh. All they care about is money and what it can do for them. That's why Jesus is here. And he knows this. That's why no charges are brought up. So look at verse 19. Annas, who continues to maintain his status and influence among the people as high priest, right? He then questioned Jesus about his disciples, which is important because there's some disciples hiding in the crowd. He questions Jesus about his disciples and his teaching, which all would have been illegal without any formal charges. You couldn't ask these kind of questions without bringing a charge. To which Jesus replies, I've spoken openly to the world. You know where to find me. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Again, Jesus says, you know where to find me. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. Brothers and sisters, this is an illegal interrogation from an unofficial judge that's coming with no charges and no witnesses. This is a mob interrogation. This is Jesus bound and tied up in the chair with the light on him, and they just beating him, trying to get him to comply. It's in the open, which is even more scary. And so like any mob interrogation, Annas, he probably gives the nod to the bruiser or the officer on his payroll, who then strikes Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? Oh, so now we're bringing up formality? Again, Annas isn't even the official high priest. And in Jewish custom, it's illegal to abuse a prisoner in court unless they curse the high priest. That's not what Jesus does here. So just pay attention to Annas and what he's doing, how he moves. By abusing Jesus, Annas gives a glimpse of how he abuses power in several other ways. He's not scared. He's not afraid. He runs things. And this broken system that he runs, it's not just. It's a game that serves his interests. And the only reason that Jesus is here isn't because of his teaching or his disciples. It's because he's a threat. He's a threat that must be eliminated. So this whole thing is wrong, which is why Jesus says here in verse 23, if what I said is wrong, then bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? And Jesus exposes their sin, their unrighteousness. And so in case you're not aware, again, this is in the open. Everyone from the soldiers to the spectators who are filling up the courtyard in this late hour, everyone knows what this visit means. Everyone knows why Jesus makes a stop here first. And this is like the drug dealer who the whole block is silent about. He's the kingpin that everyone's too afraid to speak out against. And that this man, Jesus, has gone into the belly of the beast, it means that everybody's probably thinking in a really deflated way. They're most likely assuming that injustice in this system will probably win again. And that's devastating. It creates a shrinking effect because in this moment, it doesn't really matter who you are. Jesus was probably the most powerful individual in this society who wasn't part of this Jewish elite or religious hierarchy. And now here he stands bound up in what looks like loss and defeat. It doesn't matter who you are. Revolutionary, miracle worker, Moses 2.0, it doesn't matter. You're just one person against an entire system. That's intimidating to this watching crowd. And that intimidation is probably going through the mind of an anxious disciple named Peter, who's following along closely. But before we look at Peter, brothers and sisters, the Bible doesn't shy away from these realities of how sin pervades our world, not just in us as individuals, but in structures and systems. Everything in this world has been tainted with sin and it's broken. God hates these kinds of realities, and God speaks to it. If you look in the Old Testament, throughout every single ministry of the Old Testament prophets, he exposes the ways that Israel's leaders and their structures were committed to injustice. Jesus speaks to it. But think about it. Zoom out for a minute. Why do you think God sends his son through this corrupted system if not to expose its wickedness as a part of his mission? Again, this isn't his primary mission in this world. He's not here to overthrow it or fight back. But even as Jesus stands here in the high priest's house in this illegal trial, even as he stands here as a willing participant in this state-sponsored mob interrogation, he is moving towards his primary mission, which is eradicating the problem that lies beneath and at the core of this corruption and sin, of every broken system and structure, and at the core of each and every one of our lives. Sin. He will do away with sin. And so on his way to achieving true justice for our sin and our unrighteousness, Jesus, the light of the world, will expose injustice and unrighteousness in order to point to the God who loves righteousness and justice. But as Jesus will achieve victory over the sin beneath this brokenness, he'll do it in a way where winning will feel like losing. He's still on his mission. So if anyone is intimidated by Annas' power here, if anyone's got a reason to be intimidated by this corruption and this brokenness, look at verse 15. It's Peter. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside of the door. Now, in the same way that we did last week, let's read Peter as a human being who's just like us, who's just as sinful and complex as us. We know the awful direction that he's headed in, that he will ultimately deny Jesus 3 times. Jesus already foretold it, but it's important for us to know and to see that Peter doesn't just deny Jesus in some snap decision. But he does this in this moment because of the sinfulness and complexity that exists in him and in all of us. So here in the high priest's courtyard, what we see is that Peter's a man out of his element. He's not from the big city, right? Remember, he's from Galilee. And they can tell. He's from a rural region outside of Jerusalem, which means that he's probably not familiar with the big power structures and how things really play out, how things really go down in Jerusalem. The influence of the priests and the Sanhedrin. Matthew's gospel tells us that Peter's Galilean accent actually gave him away in this setting. Maybe that southern drawl, right? He's a country boy in the big city. He's out of his element, and he's also just committed a federal crime. He struck a federal employee and cut his ear off. This looks bad on him, right? This looks really bad on him, but due to his association with Jesus, who they are already so deeply committed to maligning, it looks worse. Jesus resisted. Jesus and his people, they fought back. They even cut off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. Peter's actions cast a negative shadow on Jesus. And so for Peter, it's really time to just lay low. So we see this anonymous disciple. He goes into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter, right? What would you do in this situation? Maybe either feeling out of place or insecure, probably makes a conscious decision not to go into the courtyard with the high priest. Maybe he can't get in. Maybe that latter excuse covers for the former. So whereas this anonymous disciple is known to the high priest and doesn't really show any fear of being known, Peter maybe takes advantage of the fact that he doesn't know the high priest at this moment, and he just stays outside. To which the other disciple, who cares about him and loves him, he comes back for him. He went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. I know this guy. Let him come through. So it's night, right? It's the servant girl's responsibility for who gets into the high priest's house, and so she asked Peter to identify himself. She doesn't just ask him to identify himself. She does it in a way that somewhat confirms that she already knows who he is, because she knows who this anonymous disciple is. Verse 17, you also are not one of this man's disciples too, aren't you? It puts Peter on the spot. Maybe it's a kind of directness that Peter isn't exactly used to. But imagine, right? Maybe still in the grip of already feeling intimidation, fear and insecurity, and beneath that, self-preservation that we talked about last week. What does it cause Peter to do? It causes him to do a 180-degree turn from the profession of loyalty that he just made to Jesus hours earlier. I will lay down my life for you. He meant that. That was real. It wasn't just talk. Peter goes from that to saying what he thought he would never say. I'm not associated with this man. Denial. Disassociation. And now in a subsequent move that signifies his spiritual descent into darkness and away from the light and warmth of Jesus, it gets really cold. It gets cold. And a cold Peter goes to warm himself by the fire along with some servants and some officers. But even here, right, most likely covered up from the cold and in the darkness of night, crouching in his soul, but also with his body, Peter still can't escape the throes of his quest for self-preservation. It's still boiling inside of him. He's already done what he swore he'd never do, and in the midst of his vulnerability and weakness, he will do it again. Have you ever been here before, brothers and sisters? Nothing else matters in that moment but preserving you, protecting you. And you will do that by any means necessary. This is sinful and fallen humans. And now Peter's greatest fear will collide with his greatest mistake. Again, this isn't just a snap judgment on Peter's part. There are real emotions at play. There are real situations at play that will cause him to do what he said he will never do. And so as he's now standing with some of the very same soldiers and officers that he was just ready to fight moments ago, Peter probably just wants invisibility. Invisibility. But verse 25, as Peter was standing warming himself, they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" That question. What am I going to say? I wish. Why? Why did they ask me this? He denied it and said, "I am not." 2 times. 2 times. He feels the shame, certainly, but maybe it hadn't hit him like it really will when he thinks about this later. Each denial is shame-inducing, and there's no way that it's justified, but I mean, these were soldiers and officers, and you just committed a crime. You did something like Peter does, and then you run into the cops at the supermarket. You know anything about the person who just did this? Peter just struck one of their own. They're the last people you want knowing that you're associated with Jesus in this moment. The last people. Or are they? Peter's greatest fear will collide with his greatest mistake. And at this point, the anxiety behind Peter's self-preservation is now sending his heart racing. Protect Peter at all costs. Protect Peter's life at all costs. Protect what Peter wants at all costs. Deny, lie, disassociate. Protect Peter at all cost. That is, until one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" What is happening? This isn't just by chance. The walls are closing in. Peter's crime and his fears have cornered him. He cannot escape this moment. This is an official related to Peter's victim who places him in the garden. And now, on top of the guilt and shame of denial, comes the dread of punishment. I denied Jesus. I just burnt the bridge of my closest relationship. I've sinned against light. And now I'm going to die. I'm going to be punished because I struck a federal employee. What have I done? That's probably what Peter's thinking. What have I done? But he can't focus on that now because the spotlight is on him. Everyone at the fire is looking at him. The question has been put out and it's waiting for an answer. And every moment of silence is a further indictment, pouring on the guilt, giving away the guilty conscience. He needs to respond. And he needs to respond in a way that shows that I've really got to push these people back. So in attempting to protect himself again and de-escalate the brightness of that increasing spotlight on him, Peter denies Jesus again. And the other Gospels say that he did it so emphatically, he swore. He swore. I should push him back. I should get the spotlight off me. And at once, a rooster crowed. No doubt he was already thinking about Jesus' words. But now this weighs heavy. This pushes him spiritually, his soul, away from Jesus, away from the disciples, away, even further away than what he had done to Judas just moments before. This rooster crowing is the condemnation on his soul. How did this happen so quickly? How did this escalate so quickly? How did Peter get here? How did Peter get here? Brothers and sisters, it's the same question that we asked about Judas last week. How did these men get here? You remember the first words of Jesus' ministry and the words that he spoke to his mob that was coming to arrest him last week? What are you seeking? What are you seeking? What are you looking for, Peter? What did you think this was about? What were you after? Yes, his denials were foretold by Jesus, but just like any human being, they happen in real time with really complex and sinful wiring beneath them. How does Peter get here? Self-preservation is his MO. Self-preservation is what he has ultimately been about, even as he has followed Jesus literally. Peter had already displayed that he wanted to follow a Jesus who showed strength, who won, who would be king, who would overthrow the Romans and conquer, a Jesus that he could keep from death and defeat, even if he gave his own life for that cause, a cause he almost did give his own life for. But in the moment of Jesus' arrest, when Jesus chose peace and what looked like weakness, what looked like defeat, Peter chose violence. He chose violence, all to preserve an idea of Jesus and who Jesus should be and what that means for me. An idea that was really only about preserving Peter. But now here in the aftermath of Peter's actions in the garden, his quest for self-preservation is still pulling the strings, just like it does for all of us. He's committed a crime that is punishable by death. His actions, again, they cast a shadow over Jesus' innocence. They make it even harder for Jesus to be believed. It's all backfired. This is not how he thought things would turn out. Quote Luke Skywalker, right? This isn't going to go the way that you think. And now, if anyone deserves death, if anyone deserves to be punished and destroyed, it's Peter. He's bitten off more than he can chew. He's exposed. Peter was ready to follow a victorious Jesus, but he wasn't ready to follow Jesus to victory by leaning into loss. And brothers and sisters, this seed of sinful self-preservation exists in all of us, and it will cause us to choose ourselves over everyone and everything else every single time, by any means necessary. Look at Peter, the prioritization of self and the fear of losing self. Just like him, it will move us to doing things that we never thought we'd be capable of. This is sin. This is at the root of sin. I must do something. I must preserve and protect myself because God is holding out on me. It's every man for himself. If I don't look out for me, no one else is. I'm sovereign. I'm king. Self-preservation pulls our strings to fuel and to feed that narrative. And this is why Jesus calls all of us to deny self. To deny ourselves, to take up our cross, the cross of suffering and loss and defeat, what looks like defeat and shame, and follow him. What are you seeking? What are you seeking, brothers and sisters? Why are you following Jesus? Are we seeking a Christianity and a following Jesus that leads only to victory and strength for us? Good times, blessings? Or will we follow Jesus to victory, down the road of what looks and feels like loss, suffering, weakness, and death, even if it means losing ourselves? We have this grip on our hearts and our lives, and Jesus, he places his hand on that grip and said, will you trust me? Will you trust me with your life? Will you trust me with everything? Will you let go of self? Will you deny what self is telling you to pursue to preserve your life? And will you entrust me to preserve your life? Whoever seeks his life will lose it. Whoever gives up his life will find it. This is how Peter gets here. This is how Judas gets here. The quest, the sinful quest for self-preservation. I got it, Jesus. So in this sovereignly structured and foretold scenario, let's zoom out. On the inside of this courtyard, an innocent Jesus is being unjustly questioned and yet remains steadfast, faithful to his Creator. While on the outside, Peter orbits. He moves, he squirms, he flinches, he deflects, he hides, he cowers, he covers. The innocence of Jesus, the guilt of Peter. Jesus answers his questions perfectly. Peter falters and fails at his questioning. He lies and deceives and deflects, denies. Jesus, standing before the high priest, is in the process of laying his life down. And Peter, on the outside, is doing everything he can to save his, even if it means denying and disassociating from his closest relationships. Jesus is perfect. When Peter and you and me are imperfect. And Jesus will die even as a victim of this unjust system, so that sinful, self-preserving people like Peter and like you and me, who cling to our fragile lives, can be offered something better. Real, true, abundant life. Jesus will lay down his life so that we can give up the game of prioritizing ourselves and our lives by any means necessary. What are you seeking? Jesus will intersect and encounter us at our deepest desires, at our deepest hopes, and what we value and treasure most. And he will cause us to choose. How will we respond? Will you turn from sin? Not simply as just doing bad things and breaking the commandments, but this way of living that seeks to preserve and protect and dictate what I think leads me to life at all costs. From the youngest of us in here to the oldest of us, that plagues our souls. Will you turn from trusting yourself to believing Jesus and trusting him? Again, you don't betray Jesus like Judas did here, literally. You may not have denied Jesus like Peter does here, literally. But your quest for self-preservation has and will cause you to continue to do the same thing, to turn your back on God, to even follow him while simultaneously holding the reins of your life. How will we respond? Jesus lays down his life when we are so afraid of giving up our lives. He takes our punishment and our penalty for all of our quests to preserve ourselves. He takes that on himself. And he gives us imperishable life that can't be snuffed out or taken away or quenched. A life we could never achieve on our own. Trust him. Entrust yourself to him. Lean into loss, into defeat, into apparent weakness. Follow him down this road. He's got you. Because that road will lead to life, to victory. Will you trust him? Will you turn from self-preservation and trust in his sufficiency? Listen, I wish I had more time to talk about the difference between Peter and Judas, and even how Judas's response, as we'll see in the fall, was still one rooted in self-preservation. He responds the way he does by killing himself because he thinks he has to atone for the sin that he's committed. But Peter, who's as equally deserving of rejection from Jesus, he turns even to Jesus when he doesn't deserve it. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, I have prayed for you, that your faith would not fail even in this moment. Listen, we're going to get ready to go into communion, but when you think about all of the ways that you have chosen self and self-preservation and what that has caused you to do in your life, maybe places it's taken you that you thought you'd never go, things it's caused you to do that you thought you'd never do. I encourage you not to work to atone for your own sin in that way, to try to make up for it or to do good things, but turn to Jesus. Confess your sin. Together, we're going to stand up now and we're going to confess our sin corporately.